Hello and welcome to the Sustainability Skillset Podcast, a show where we explore careers in sustainability and the skills that help you succeed. I'm glad you're here. If you are passionate about sustainability and hungry to learn, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Louis DeMaso, a sustainability consultant and young sustainability professional learning right along with you. In this episode, I had the privilege of speaking with Michael Jung, the executive director of the ICF Climate Center. Their research institute models climate solutions and publishes impactful work that helps us understand the path to net zero. Michael and I discussed their recent report on the 3 critical solutions to climate change, including increasing electric vehicle adoption, improving the energy efficiency of buildings, and transitioning our electricity supply to renewable sources. He described the inspiring work of the ICF Climate Center and dove into his role leading it. He shared some great career tips around showing up with curiosity and willingness to learn, building genuine relationships, and the best way to approach mentorships. I found a story he shared about boarding a past employer's private jets just to get FaceTime with their executives particularly entertaining. It demonstrates how his entrepreneurial spirit and willingness to put himself out there has led to success. Finally, he highlighted that we will need people in all industries with all skill sets to achieve the major overhauls to our economy needed for reaching our net zero goals. This is great news if you're interested in a sustainability career. We need you and your expertise, whatever that may be. If you are wondering where your current skills might transfer to a sustainability career, look for where climate change will intersect with and impact your industry. I hope you enjoy this episode and get something useful from it. If you do, I would love to hear from you.
Louis, it's nice to sit down, or I guess we are both sitting down. Nice to see each other face to face over a camera.
Yes, it's super nice to sit down with you, and I'm really excited about our discussion.
You know, it sounds nice to say sit down together, but probably more accurate to say like we're sitting down simultaneously.
While looking at each other over Zoom. It's always a pleasure to have these kinds of video calls. So thanks so much for your time, and we're excited to dive in. So I was curious to hear a bit more about the ICF Climate Center that you are a founder and executive director of, and the kind of work that they're doing.
Yeah, it's a funny story, which I hope you don't mind me sharing, which is that ICF is actually one of the first first job offers I ever got was going to be to work with ICF to help, get Energy Star up and running back in like the mid 1990s, late 1990s. And I've been thinking about ICF ever since. For those of you who don't know ICF, ICF is a consultancy. We've got about 9,000 people across 80 offices or so around the world. And I think that the beginning of ICF is very much, relevant to understanding who ICF is and more importantly, why ICF exists. ICF was born in the late 1960s. A couple of Defense Department analysts, factoring like the whiz kid days of Robert McNamara and the JFK, they got together and asked, what is the biggest problem that we can do something about right now? And when they looked around them, they saw inner city Washington, D.C. really struggling. It was urban renewal, mom and pop businesses were really kind of, swimming upstream, and it was just a hard time. And so they said, you know what, like, let's do what we can to help these small businesses get through this. And led by their friend, who was a World War II ace Air Force pilot, one of the Tuskegee Airmen, a guy named Lucky Lester. The Tuskegee Airmen was this all-black Air Force squadron that Lucky Lester flew like 90 missions and never got shot down. That's why he was called Lucky. He was the first CEO of what they called the Inner City Fund. Today, we would call it social venture capital or social impact investing. But they started this fund to help small businesses in inner city DC get through it. And it turned out that capital really wasn't the constraint. It was the consulting that they did that delivered the bigger benefit. And it made an impact. And they happened to be at the right time at the right place, just as the then what became the Department of Energy and what became the Environmental Protection Agency were both getting put together. And so ICF was, at that intersection of environment and energy from the very beginning of those agencies. And we've been doing that work ever since. So that's kind of the origin story for ICF. It's kind of what drew me to ICF in the first place as like an opportunity. I had to turn it down because I would have had to move from Ohio, where my girlfriend was getting ready to start medical school, and move to DC to join, the EPA and this ICF team that was going to start Energy Star. And I knew that as soon as she figured out how much better she could do, the jig would be up. So I made the hard call. I stuck around. It was the right call. She's the mother of our 3 children, my wife. But I've been thinking about ICF ever since. And so it's a real, nice boomerang to become the executive director at this ICF Climate Center.
I know you were a policy director in Ohio for a while, but you were originally offered ICF and then only got around to leading ICF much later in your career?
Not leading ICF. The Climate Center is like a think tank within the consultancy.
Right.
And so ICF, as a consultancy, all of our work is client facing. Clients come to us with questions that they don't know how to answer themselves. We help them. We run the models. We build the tools. We do the analysis. But the Climate Center, as a think tank within the consultancy, is designed to ask the questions that our clients aren't yet asking us, and to rather than give a client a deliverable that's their intellectual property under NDA. The Climate Center is public facing, not client facing. And so we turn around and give our thought leadership away for free. I think of it in terms of the law of the river. I grew up in Kentucky, and every summer my Boy Scout troop would go whitewater rafting in West Virginia. And the law of the river says that if someone falls out of your raft, your job is to bring him back into your raft, keep him safe. But the law of the river says if you see anyone swimming downstream, you pull them into your raft, even if they weren't in your raft. You pull them in, make sure they're safe, and then figure it out. And that's kind of what the Climate Center is about. We know that if our clients at ICF are the only ones who figure out how to do the energy transition and address the climate crisis, that's not enough. We need to help everyone that we see swimming through the drink.
I love that mission. And you have so many great resources published online. I was recently reading a report from the ICF Climate Center that was on super solutions for reducing our economy's greenhouse gas emissions. And it was saying that those solutions, in combination with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, could put the U.S. on a path towards reaching its net zero goals by 2050. Could you provide any additional context for this report and describe its importance?
Yeah. So since, for decades now, ICF has been doing a lot of the modeling that goes into the energy policy that has guided the EPA and the DOE on their planning. We run something called the IPM, Integrated Planning Model, and several other models that are sort of the bread and butter, the anchor models for how we understand the energy that's driving our economy. We wanted to understand, because our clients, they'll ask us like, how is this affecting me? But we wanted to ask the question, how far down the road are these policies going to get us towards the climate goals that our country has? Bigger question. And so we ran the numbers. We aimed our models at this question and found that we're going to come roughly halfway. We're going to come up to and that's a big big step forward, but it's certainly not all the way across the line. And so we then modeled out what would it take? What are the longest levers we can pull to get us to where we have set ourselves accountable to being? It's not a surprise, but I think directionally we understood this collectively. But we were the first to really kind of quantify it with the level of detail that we did, to say that it's electric vehicles. We know that's a big part of the Inflation Reduction Act, and we know that's what we need to do. But we now know, because of our modeling, that we're going to have to double down. We're going to need 100 times more electric vehicles than are on the road today. We're going to need that amount by 2050. We're 240 million of these by 2050. And that's a substantial increase. That's 2.5 times more what we model would have happened just under the BIL and IRA. We also know that, building decarbonization, we're going to have to deploy, lots of heat pumps, lots of, rooftop solar, et cetera, energy efficiency, what we call measures. And we calculated it's going to be over 1 billion measures that we're going to have to deploy by 2050. Sounds insurmountable, perhaps, but we also model out that it's going to be something in the order of 962 million measures will have taken place because of the BIL and IRA. And so it's a 15% increase, not, 1 billion sounds like too much until you realize that you're starting from 967 million.
Right. And the report gets into some actionable steps that can be taken to try to close that gap, right?
Yeah, so between EVs doubling down, building decarbonization, keeping our eye on that ball, and the last is clean energy, where we know we have to essentially decarbonize the grid. That's not a surprise, but we model out pathways within that ecosystem to get there, and we also calculate that we're going to have to start using more what we call green molecules. So this is like green hydrogen and renewable natural gas. We're going to have to use more green molecules than fossil fuel molecules by 2050. And that's a big leap. That's a huge change from what is sort of projected to happen under our models as business as usual under BIL and IRA. So clean energy has to overtake fossil energy. That's kind of the third leg of the stool.
Absolutely. Were there any particular solutions or aspects of those three prongs that you found interesting?
Yeah, electric vehicles, that's something that's very visible. So let's talk about that for a second. There's, as we all know, there's lots of rebates and incentives out there that are put forth in the current legislation. But it's not enough. We're going to have to make sure that the infrastructure behind it is there too. It doesn't help anyone if there's a charging station that gets built out, but there's not the grid behind it that's capable of supporting it. It doesn't help, if you build the infrastructure, what's the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. The grid doesn't exactly work that way. You've got a plan. And so, we know we need battery manufacturing capability. We need to have access to the raw materials behind, these kinds of, rare earth minerals. We need processing capabilities. We're going to have to build this out. This is going to be kind of like a wartime level effort, in terms of EVs, in terms of building decarbonization, in terms of clean energy, both electrons and molecules. This is mobilization on a scale that I've not seen in my lifetime. I don't know if hardly any people alive today will have seen the kind of national scale mobilization of resources, attention, of commitment that we're going to need to get there.
Well, it's so exciting to be a part of, and your ICF Climate Center's contribution to helping us get there seems significant. So I appreciate all the work you do and the interesting information that you guys put out into the world.
Well, it's one thing to know which direction to go in. It's another thing to know how fast do we need to go? How far will we need to go? What's the pace that's going to be necessary? We are a technical company, in our DNA. We like to quantify things. We like to have, a keen understanding of the details. And that's the contribution that we try to bring.
So what's it like leading the ICF Climate Center?
Oh, gosh, Liz. My father used to tell me, Mike, if you're the smartest guy in the room, you're in the wrong room. Working at ICF, I'm definitely in the right room. There are 9,000 people, all of whom are smarter than me. Deep subject matter expertise. But that's not even the best part. The best part of it is that ICF, which is a publicly traded for-profit company, has all of the rigor, the discipline, and the urgency that a for-profit entity has. But the people who work at ICF have all of the purpose and the passion and the mission that you might associate with like a nonprofit. And so we're kind of like the best of both worlds. These are, I'm a Boy Scout, as I mentioned earlier. You have to leave the campsite cleaner than it was when you got there. The people working at ICF, it's just like I shared in the origin story. We're all asking, like, what is the biggest problem we can do something about right now? And a lot of us, not all of us, ICF works not just on energy and climate. We also do work in the realms of healthcare, refugee resettlement, criminal justice. We're just a bunch of do-gooders, a bunch of Boy Scouts, proverbially, all trying to make our difference.
Sounds like an exciting team to be a part of.
Oh, it's great.
What does your job involve in the day-to-day?
The day-to-day. So the Climate Center is, we're not a line of business. We're not really sort of like an entity within ICF. It's more of an initiative. So a lot of the resources that I call upon are, they're all dotted lines. I don't have, command and control. I don't have anyone who, I can boss around because, they're accountable to me. I lead through persuasion. I did Outward Bound when I was a kid. And the model that we used there was, don't lead from in front. Don't drag us down from behind. Be in the middle. Lead from within. And that's the model that I use at ICF, to inspire, to engage, but I don't have command and control. That's not what really gets the work done, I find.
That seems congruent with a lot of sustainability roles in big companies where, there's a sustainability department and potentially sustainability goals, but it might not be directly embedded with the operations departments that they're tasked with influencing and trying to steer. So leading from a place of persuasion and communicating the value to each individual business unit becomes really important in that case. Could you speak a little bit about to how you do that and any tips you might have for approaching that challenge?
It's a good question. I will clarify, Louis, that my role in leading the Climate Center is one of generating thought leadership and being public facing. Sort of the face of ICF's energy and climate work. But I am, there are other people besides me who lead our sustainability work. ICF, we were the first professional services firm in that category to become carbon neutral in 2006. So we've been doing it, for far longer than most people have been thinking about it. We've been walking that walk. And so I would say, the function that we have for, doing the right thing is embedded as opposed to, it is part of who we are and why we are. It is not this sort of off to the side thing. I began my career in the electric utility sector. So I've been in a lot of entities since then that, there's like the sustainability office and it's off to the side. And then there's everyone else who like keeps the lights on, keeps the machine running. That's a tough model to affect change from within. It requires the right personality, the right charisma, the right sort of relationships. And those are not given. In fact, those are more the exception than the rule, I have found. Whereas I think today what we are seeing in industry is, and I think part of it is owed to policy, is an internalization of these priorities into the business operations themselves, as opposed to an ancillary sort of function, which I think, you can only get so far if it's off to the side.
That's so important is integrating those sustainability considerations into every aspect of the business, right?
I tend to think of this as, when we stop asking ourselves, like, how would we make this sustainable? If it becomes part of just how do we do anything, then, it's built into the math. And that's when it really gets done.
How do we do that?
I think we're making steps. An example that I'll give is that, disclosure. Disclosure is what makes financial markets work. It's information is the currency really of financial markets. And so as, information about the sustainability, this pivotal moment in my career, I'll give you as an example, was, I was working at American Electric Power, and AEP back in the day started receiving these shareholder resolutions where some groups had figured out that they could use their rights as shareholders to ask questions of corporations. And at the time, AEP was the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the Western Hemisphere. Like, we were the largest consumer of coal in the Americas. And some folks figured out if we owned a few shares, you didn't have to own a lot, you can ask questions at these shareholder meetings. And the company has fiduciary responsibilities. And so the first couple of questions were a little clumsy. They didn't go very far. But eventually they figured it out. And we worked with these shareholders to say, yeah, that's a good question. What is the financial risk posed by AEP's exposure to carbon policy and pricing? And, we formed a board subcommittee. They sat down with, experts from across the country in so many different disciplines. I was fortunate to be staffed on that board subcommittee. So I was the fly on the wall, setting up these meetings and just taking notes. But I saw it happen in real time, where these members of the boards of directors of this, mega company, these light bulbs started going off in their head. They said, whoa, this is a big deal. This is a risk. We have a fiduciary obligation as board members to make sure that the company manages these risks in a way that is good for the shareholders. And so, AEP went from then being, sort of the bad guy, if you will, to committing to, not building new coal plants, to starting putting money into, carbon capture research. We bought the first logging rights we bought up and retired logging rights in Bolivian rainforest as one of the early Clean Development Mechanism projects, CDM projects under the Kyoto Protocol. we joined a group of other utilities around the world, and we started putting up wind turbines in the Galapagos Islands and hydropower in the Kingdom of Bhutan. Like, it went from like being, sort of like the Dark Knights to becoming the Boy Scouts. And,
Wow.
and that was really fascinating to watch unfold.
That sounds amazing. And the act of asking questions sounds like it really drives interest in those topics, right?
Harnessing mechanisms like shareholder resolutions to ask different questions that have been asked before, was a novel application of an existing tool. And we're doing more and more of that today, in different ways. The system is what it is, but we can use it for different ends by kind of reorienting its tools.
Yeah, it's interesting how just highlighting and asking those questions can really drive interest in things that hadn't been really considered before.
If you don't ask, you don't get an answer if you don't ask a question, right?
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. It seems like in a lot of consumer packaged goods and food and agriculture supply chains, which is what I primarily interact with, a lot of sustainability work throughout the supply chain is being driven by the questions that are being asked by retailers and buyers of those products. And it's the same thing
hopefully
where
consumers even too.
Exactly, driven by consumers. Yeah, the consumers drive the retailers, the big box retailers, to be considering this stuff and then needing information from their supply chain. And so they ask their supply chain. And even if the information is not available, which in many cases, we're still trying to get to that point of having that information available, just the asks, just the questions that are passing down show that those big customers are interested in this, and it's really noticeable, and it drives sustainability progress.
I've got 3 kids, Louis, and I've enjoyed this kind of fun phase. I'm sure there's like a module in their curriculum that, that when they hit it, this is what it triggers. Where they come home and for like the first time ever, they go into the pantry and actually read the nutrition labels on the food that we're making for them. And they're asking questions that they'd never thought about before. And then they're like, wait a second, why is there so much of this? Or are we getting enough of that? Where does this recommended daily allowance come from? Wait, we're only getting 15%. What else are we eating that gives us the other 85%, Dad? And there's just like this light bulb that goes off in their heads in the same way that these light bulbs went off in these, boards of director member heads when I was staffing this subcommittee at AEP. Like you see these light bulbs go off. And once you are aware of something, it's really, you never become unaware of that. Like once you know what's in your food, or once you know what's coming out of your, smokestacks, you can't not know about it.
Absolutely. And once those questions are asked, then it becomes a matter of how do we find answers, right? And the data there can be a big challenge. And I know that,
and that's where companies like ICF jumped in. We,
exactly,
we run them under, we build the models, we help with the data.
That's right. Have you found that does the information that you collect then support companies in taking action on sustainability?
We work with a lot of companies, but ICF is probably best known as being a government contractor. We help agencies, federal agencies primarily, but we also have a Europe and Asia division that works with European governments and Asian governments, helping governments to design policies, to implement policies, and going downstream from there, then private sector entities often have to comply with those policies, or do what their part to meet those policies in their deployment. So when it comes to program design and implementation, ICF is well known in government contracting circles as being the folks who get it right. We were in the room when Energy Star was created, and Energy Star today is probably the most visible and successful sort of efficiency program that folks are using every day. Once you see an Energy Star label, you notice when it's not there, and you start to make choices. You realize that, wait a second, the upfront cost of a device is only part of the total cost of these devices, and that's a labeling thing, that's an information thing, that's asking questions that hadn't been asked before, and that's ICF largely behind the scenes has been sort of supporting that program since its inception.
So if somebody's wanting to work at or contribute to an organization like the ICF Climate Center, what kinds of skills are necessary for that, and what kinds of work would they be doing?
Gosh, there's it's almost like it's more of a challenge to figure out what is the skill that is not needed to work in the energy transition and address the climate crisis.
And that's good news for somebody who wants to transition in, right? Because that means that they probably have some kind of transferable skill. Yeah.
I mean, like I said before, this is like a wartime level of mobilization that's going to be necessary. This is like victory gardens and like all hands on deck, like, buy bond, wartime bonds, like everyone has to do their part. Rosie the Riveter, think of it, at that level. The obvious direction is, I should be a climate scientist, or I should be like an energy engineer or something like that. And those are, predictable and certainly needed. We're going to have massive shortages in terms of like electricians and HVAC installers and, people who just kind of like, put things together, on the infrastructure side of things. But we're also going to need storytellers and writers, and creative, just all manner of talent is going to be necessary. Climate affects healthcare. Health systems are going to have to adapt. Education. I can't think of many fields where climate is not going to become a factor if it isn't already.
What does somebody do with that, though? What is if they're working in health, for instance, and they want to make climate a greater part of their career? Do you have any thoughts for how they might go about doing that in a practical way?
The most immediate thought that comes to mind, Louis, is recognizing that, this past summer is the first summer that many Americans came to understand that the climate crisis manifests itself as public health threats. Wildfire smoke, extreme heat, those are public health emergencies, but they are climate crisis manifestations. And so if you're in public health, you're going to start to see, cities and counties and governments start creating, chief heat officer. Public health systems are going to need people who understand how to translate climate data into planning for public health systems. These are intersections that are we're going to cross more and more, unfortunately. But it means that there's opportunity for good work to be done by people who can sort of speak multiple languages when it comes to the climate and health, or climate and whatever you have in mind.
So it sounds like in the search for where the opportunity is to integrate sustainability into your career, you might find it where climate change would impact your industry.
Yeah, climate adaptation and resilience, that's going to be, we crossed that line. Our world today is already, we're having to change the way things work, the way we live, the way we work, the way we get around, because of climate change. America, is going to rebuild itself essentially, over the next couple of decades. All of our infrastructure is going to have to be rebuilt, partly because it was, just kind of reached its expiration date already in many cases, but also because the time when most of it was built was not a time where climate change was showing up. It's been said that, the generations alive today are the first to experience the impacts of climate change and maybe the last to have an opportunity to really affect how bad it gets. Our infrastructure is, the first infrastructure to experience, these impacts, but it's also, whatever replaces it is going to be, need to be built in a way that is resilient to the impacts that we know are coming down the road.
It's a good time to update everything when everything is coming due for updating, right?
Well, I mean, the sad thing is that, the folks who do modeling, not just at ICF, but everywhere around the world, a lot of it was right? We kind of saw extreme heat. We kind of saw polar vortexes. We saw these things coming, and so by and large, we've kind of run the models and now have empirical data to say yes, we pretty much. The good news is that those guesses, now empirical observations, can guide how we build the next round of infrastructure, and we can see around the corner better than we ever could before.
Well, the work that ICF Climate Center is doing to highlight some of those areas will certainly be helpful in trying to design the future of infrastructure, right?
We do so much resilience planning for communities, building their roads, what kind of materials, what sort of designs, building bridges, building buildings, heating and cooling systems, you name it, public health systems even too. There's so much climate resilience work that is underway. Even by taking place in places where people don't necessarily agree on the causes of the climate, they are in agreement that yes, things are different now than they were before. I live in Portland, Oregon, and we had a heat dome a couple of years ago that got so hot that we had to, curtail service on our light rail lines that serve, the public transit, kind of, get people from A to B, because the metal in the rails was not spec'd to operate at that temperature, and it was too soft. It was bending out of shape. Like no one ever imagined that Portland would have multiple days of 120 degree heat. Just wasn't foreseeable, a couple of decades ago when these things were built. But now we know what's coming down the road because we've seen glimpses of it already.
So I would love to get into your story arc a little bit and hear about how you got to where you are today, because it's a incredibly interesting position to be in. And I would love to hear about kind of what drove you to get into climate work in the first place, and how you built up the skills and credibility to participate in something like the ICF Climate Center.
Well, I was born on planet Krypton, and as it was exploding, I was born in Korea, and I immigrated to the States when I was 3. As I mentioned before, Louis, I'm a Boy Scout. Growing up in Kentucky, you have access to a lot of fun mountains and gorges and valleys and caves. So I've always loved the outdoors. And one day I was reading the newspaper in high school. I'm kind of a nerd that way. And I noticed that the article in the top left-hand corner of the front page of the paper that day began with a sentence: 1/5 of humanity was disappointed today when the International Olympic Committee awarded the year 2000 games to Sydney instead of Beijing. And I was like, wow, 1/5 of humanity. Like, I feel like I'm supposed to do some good in this world. I have no idea how to do it. But maybe if I do like a small thing for 1/5 of humanity, that'll add up and it'll be, a meaningful contribution. So I figured I should learn about China. And so I started taking Chinese language classes, to learn about history, society, etc. I ended up majoring in East Asian studies in college. And I came, I live by this 80-20 rule, which is, like Halloween's right around the corner, right? So in my household, like 80% of the candy is eaten by 20% of my household. I have 5 people in my household.
That's the 80-20 rule, yeah.
You can guess who that 20% is. But let's look at China's problems. Like what's the biggest problem that China is wrestling with? And at the time, China was losing like 7 to 9% of their GDP every year to environmental degradation. Far and away, the largest source of bleeding of capital in the country. And I was like, wow, that seems like a problem. Maybe I can learn more about that. What's causing that? And, when you look at it through a couple different lenses, they all kind of start pointing back to energy, the extraction, the utilization, the externalities. Energy causes a lot of environmental impacts, it turns out, not just in China, but everywhere. And so I thought, okay, let's study Chinese energy. And if you look at energy, the biggest pieces of the pie, the 80-20 rule again, 80% of it is transportation and power. And so I studied transportation in the People's Republic of China. I looked at 5-year plans for multiple decades, and spent an entire summer at Lawrence Berkeley Lab pouring through Chinese state statistics books, and came up with this projection that China was going to become a net oil importer. And at the time, that sounded ridiculous because China was a huge exporter at that time. But I looked at, all the 5-year plans, all the road construction that they were putting together at the provincial level, and started adding it all up and drawing out the lines, and, the lines crossed. And I was like, wow, they're going to be an oil importer in decades. I was a little wrong. It happened actually sooner than I projected, but I got a prize for that college thesis. And I felt like, okay, maybe I'm onto something. But Chinese state data is like super painful to work with. They just, it's just a lot of like manual labor, crunching spreadsheets together. It's a painful process. And so I said, let's learn about the other half of the equation, the power side. But let's not just do it in China, because power is pretty similar everywhere. Mm-hmm. Basically, you boil water to make steam, and that steam runs the turbine, and it's every country, every place does it roughly the same way. You can burn different things to make turbine spin, or use different technologies to make the turbine spin, but that's basically the same thing everywhere. So I got into the power sector, and I spent a solid decade working in American Electric Power, just kind of learning the ropes, cutting my teeth. I'm not an engineer. I don't even play one on TV, but I spent enough time with engineers to gain a really a profound appreciation for what engineers do really well as what are their blind spots as a discipline. And that led to an opportunity to go into public service. I worked for a gubernatorial campaign and administration in Ohio. Got to write some policy that changed the landscape, took Ohio from sort of being a laggard to a leader when it came to state level energy policy.
Okay.
And then spent another decade in clean tech, where I was trying to disrupt from another angle. And that's what I've been doing until I landed at ICF recently.
When you got into the energy industry, you described not being an engineer. What were you doing at that time that contributed to the energy industry? I spent a year in Korea after college to learn the language, to meet my relatives, to live abroad. And when I came back, needed a job, so I just sent out my resume everywhere. My girlfriend, the one I mentioned before, was going to start medical school at Ohio State University. She's from Cleveland. And so I was like, okay, I should figure out how to be near her. And I looked at, what are the big employers in Columbus, Ohio, where the Ohio State University is located. And one of the big ones in the energy space. And American Electric Power happens to be headquartered there. So I sent in a resume. I sent a resume to all sorts of different companies, including ICF or EPA, as you know. And I didn't hear back for a long time from AEP. In fact, when I got this job offer from EPA, the one that would have me working with ICF, I was like literally ready to accept it. And then this letter, kind of cryptic, comes in from AEP saying, "We'd like to invite you to come up to our office for an interview." And I thought, oh, well, I should do that interview before I, take this other job. But the funny thing is that it had taken so long, and it didn't really say anything about what the role would be, what the position would be. I sent in this cold letter and resume, like there was no position that I was applying for. It was just like, "Hi, can I work for you?" And so I arrived. I was taken up this elevator. It was a long elevator ride. I remember where I grew up in Kentucky, there aren't many tall buildings. And so like when you go to like the 20-something floor of a building, you notice like how long it takes. That's an important building, right?
Yeah. And so, or a really slow elevator. And so I get off the elevator. I'm led into like this gigantic office. And there's a fellow sitting behind a desk at like the far end of this office. So it's like this really long walk to sit down in front of him. And he doesn't like get up to shake my hand or anything. There's no warm welcome. He just kind of like sits there and watches me walk down, towards his desk.
And you're thinking, am I in the right place?
I felt like I was being sent to the principal's office list. I was like, am I in trouble? Like, this doesn't feel like I thought it would feel. And he looks at me. He's like, "Michael Jung." He's looking at my resume, but then he looks at me. He's like, "Michael Jung, what are we going to do with you?" I'm like, oh my God, I am in trouble. And he explains that apparently my resume had been bouncing around at AEP. No one knew what to do with me, but no one was ready to be the one that said no. And so I just kind of got like bounced from desk to desk to desk. And it finally landed on this guy's desk. His name was Jim Markowski. He was the guy in charge, an executive vice president, in charge of the fleet, all like 38,000 megawatts of coal-fired electricity at American Electric Power, this massive generating fleet. And he said, "Mike, no one knows what to do with you. You're not like us. You're not an engineer. You don't have any particularly relevant skills, but no one wants to get rid of you." So that's how it ended up on my desk.
Did they describe anything about what was the things that caught their eye that made them want to take a chance on you?
Well, the way Jim put it was, he's like, "Mike, I'm going to let you rotate through the departments in my control. I'm going to give you a year. If you have a job offer at the end of the year, welcome to AEP. If not, it's been nice knowing you."
Sounds a bit like an internship.
It was like an internship, but like Also a bit of like, let's throw this guy in the deep end and see if he can figure out how to swim. It was intimidating. It really was. I spent the first year, almost year and a half, I think, every single meeting I went into, I had this tiny little notepad, and I would just jot down all the acronyms and initialisms and jargon that I did not know what on earth they were talking. I thought it was a foreign language. I learned a lot of foreign languages. Learning utility was maybe the hardest foreign language I've ever had to learn. And it took like a year and a half before I would start consistently leading meetings without having anything new written down.
I can completely relate to that. When I first joined the agriculture industry, it was the same. I actually carried a notebook with me and was writing down all these things about tomatoes that I had never thought about before. And it took me so long, but writing those things down and just documenting everything was so helpful. And I'm sure it was for you too.
I had to buy textbooks to teach myself power economics, but I also had a lot of times I just had to find people and ask them very humbly, almost embarrassingly, I heard someone say something, and I wrote down the letters of what I thought it sounded like, but I don't know if I got the letters right. Can you can you tell me if I got the letters right, and so I can look it up? That's how bad it was, but that's how you learn.
Not being afraid
everything
to
is
ask
hard
questions.
until it's easy. Everything is
Right.
mysterious until you understand it.
It's an incredible story of just humility and not being afraid to ask questions and jumping in and taking that opportunity to learn rather than become overwhelmed and shut down.
I was also afforded the privilege of having some really amazing mentors, people who were really good at things that I wasn't good at, people who had patience for me being on the learning curve for a long time, but also people who understood that I was good at things that they maybe weren't good at yet, and had abilities that they were going to need in the coming years. And so, mentors played a huge role in my career, and it's something that I still think about a lot as I have transitioned to becoming more of a mentor than a mentee. That's I think maybe as much work as I've done over my career on energy and climate, I'm starting to feel like the work that I'm doing in mentorship may be right up there in terms of the impact that I leave.
As somebody who is a mentor to mentees, do you have any tips for somebody who is either looking for a mentor or somebody who has a mentor and helping them get the most out of that experience?
That's a good question. I in my experience, the relationships that I've gotten the most out of as a mentee, someone who's been mentored, are ones where it's really grounded in sort of a relationship, a human relationship. You can talk about stuff that's not necessarily work related. Whether you share an interest in food. One of my mentors, we like to eat at this Vietnamese place that was right up from the office. A lot of the people at AEP were not on board with Vietnamese food yet. It wasn't really a thing, back in the late 1990s so much. But he liked it spicy, and I was right there with him, and so that's where we would go. And we just that was a default thing that we could share. And over a lot of different Vietnamese meals, we came to find a lot more in common as well. But start with the human, because if you don't understand who someone is, it's hard to get a lot of ground covered in terms of what you can learn from each other.
Sounds like building that relationship from a place of humanity and just getting to know the person rather than approaching it as a knowledge extraction exercise sounds important.
I think it matters more now than ever before, because and I think it's there's something to be gained in terms of efficiency and productivity, but there's also something lost in terms of sort of the intangibles, and I think that really shows up in that mentor-mentee relationship.
So you described the way you got into your career, and we have the arc of you getting into policy, which is something that we could probably spend much more time than we have diving into. What would you say has been one of the common themes or biggest strengths as you've navigated your career and gotten to where you are today?
This is going to sound like almost Mark Twain-like, but show up. It sounds trivial, but it's kind of profound. I had a summer internship when I was a college kid. The town I grew up in Kentucky happened to have an oil company, Ashland Petroleum, which sounds like a weird place to have an oil company. I guess back in the Second World War, the government found German subs prowling our coasts, and they realized, oh my God, all of our oil refineries are on the coast. And so they propped up a couple of oil companies to refine oil inland. And so one of these companies, Ashland Petroleum, was located on the Ohio River. So submarine German subs couldn't, blow up refineries on the Ohio River, they figured. So I, like every kid in Ashland, Kentucky, at some point you get an internship at the oil company. I spent a summer there, and I was just like looking through the corporate directory one day, like trying to find a department for something or other. And I noticed there's an aviation department. I was like, oh, do we make aviation fuels? What is that? And I was just curious. I showed up. I called over and I said, hey, I'd like to learn about the aviation department. And they said, oh, great. Where are you flying to? And I was like, oh, I guess we operate aircraft. And I said, I'm not sure. What are the options? And they said, well, here the planes. Here's the link to the schedule for where the planes are going this week. And I learned that AEP or Ashland Petroleum had a terrible accident a long time ago where the CEO and the COO and the CFO, I think, were all in the same corporate jet, and it went down, and it almost took the company under. And so they instituted this rule, you're never going to have more than 2 C-suite officers on a plane together. The result of that rule was you ended up having 7 aircraft for this relatively modest size, oil company, but this aviation department, a small fleet of aircraft. And the rule was, if you were an employee, you could what they call deadhead on the flights. So if one of the executives was chartering the flight to, take them to a conference in New York City, you could ride along, and all you had to do was pay what the taxes would be on an equivalent commercial airfare. So it'd be $20.
And you get to spend an entire flight sitting in the plane with somebody who's incredibly influential and knowledgeable.
You show up. And so I did this a couple of times in the summer. And the first time, the executive just very, very intensely reads the newspaper and actively ignores you because why would they talk to this kid? But eventually they relent and they're like, what's your name, kid? By the end of the summer, I had 3 or 4 job offers because I had shown up. I had shown up in a place where they had not expected to see me. I had shown up with a curiosity and a willingness, that's kind of half the battle. A lot of the times, when AEP did this shareholder committee, this board of directors subcommittee to address these shareholder resolutions, I showed up. I said, someone needs to staff that. I raised my hand even before anyone asked, are there any volunteers? Just kind of, showing up. That's been a lot of what I give myself credit for, in terms of, having earned some of the opportunities that I've gotten is just because, I've gone out of my way to show up.
It seems like a consistent theme, both in the macro scale of the big opportunities that you've pursued and also the micro scale of carrying a notebook around and, asking a question when it might be easier to ignore the question or just glaze over it and, not potentially embarrass yourself by, looking like you don't know something, but just taking that opportunity to try to get the most out of a situation that you can.
At every turn. And, I tell people, sometimes people ask, well, what if you're not invited? How do you still show up? When I was in graduate school, I went to the Kennedy School. And so when, notable people come to speak at Harvard University, they often speak at the Kennedy School's kind of campus. I'm just a grad student. I'm not going to get any FaceTime with these, prime ministers and heads of state and, Nobel laureates and whatnot. But anyone can walk up to the microphone and ask the first question. And I learned that that's almost as good as being on stage with them because you plant a seed, you start a discussion, you can go up to them afterwards, and now you have something to talk about. Other people come up to you. They're like, hey, that's an interesting question. And now you've got something to talk about with them. And all it took was standing up and going first.
That seems to me almost like a analogy to social media networking and kind of our modern age of technology now, of just starting conversations and putting information out there into the world, putting yourself out there, and how that gives you the opportunity to connect with people and and be seen.
I mean, that's kind of how our conversation got started, right, Louis?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, with just our last few minutes here, I'd like to pull way back out to how we started here with kind of the work that ICF does, the American economy. One of the things that I like to ask all my guests who are involved in those kinds of things is, what are some of the most important steps we can take in business and society to accelerate our transition to a more sustainable world? And what types of professionals do you think will be most important to guide us there?
I guess, 80-20 rule. The biggest pieces that we need to put in place, I think of it, the climate crisis is kind of the big thing. What can we do about the climate crisis from a mitigation perspective? It's the energy transition by and large. There's a lot of stuff we can do on agriculture and land use and forestry and whatnot. But I would say energy is kind of the 80% chunk of that part of the mitigation solution. And then you go into the energy side, and I would say if you're going to take big swings at it, let's swing with EVs and heat pumps. That's kind of the ones we need to hit home runs with. If you're looking at the resilience side of it, it's all about, I would say the most important piece of resilience we need to focus on is utility sector resilience. Because we're electrifying so much of the economy, we need to make darn sure that the electric grid infrastructure, that we are placing a lot of eggs into one basket. Let's make sure that basket holds up, because the storms are coming, the heat is here, the cold is arriving. That grid needs to be more robust than ever before at a time when that grid is 40, 50, 60 years old already. So we're going to have to rebuild it once just to replace it. We're going to have to build another grid on top of it to meet population growth, economic growth. We're going to have to build a third grid on top of that to meet electrification load. Maybe a fourth or fifth grid if we're going to start extracting, carbon out of the atmosphere even. We're asking a lot of the grid. And so let's make sure that infrastructure is resilient. And then above and beyond that, it's, roads, bridges, the physical infrastructure that is, underneath it all.
And so anyone looking to get into a sustainability career would be well suited to get into energy, something related to energy. And like you described, it doesn't have to be an energy engineer. It can be anyone who contributes to an organization that's working on that.
We're going to have to finance it. We're going to need to do stakeholder engagement on it. We're going to have to write copy all about it. We're going to have to do sales and marketing for the new pieces that we're going to have to deploy. We're going to have to insure it. We're going to have to underwrite. Everything needs to get done.
Well, it's encouraging for people who are in careers right now that might not be super sustainability focused, but it sounds to me like the main message is that any career can be sustainability focused. You just got to find the intersection.
Climate affects everything, and everything affects climate.
Yep. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for taking the time today to share some stories from your career, some insights that you've gained from the work that the ICF Climate Center does, and generally sharing your experiences with us listeners.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. You're doing such important work, engaging folks in these kinds of conversations and sharing their stories, because everyone needs to become a part of this, because it's going to affect all of us.
Any last thoughts that you'd like to share?
The last thing I'll share is there's a thing, Open Door Climate, that on LinkedIn is sort of a way to indicate that you're open to having these conversations. I'm on it. I love talking with people. I love helping people become part of this work. As I mentioned before, perhaps my best legacy is if I can help inspire those who are going to pick up where my generation leaves off.
Search #OpenDoorClimate on LinkedIn or any other social media platform that you're on. There is a large community of sustainability professionals there who would be willing to chat and help you out.
I'm glad we're both a part of this.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Michael. Hope you have a nice evening, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks. Bye.
And for those listening, I hope you enjoyed this episode and that you'll join us next time on the Sustainability Skillset Podcast.